Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz, the godfather of football analytics and founder of Football Outsiders. And today on the show with us, we have Nate Weller from the SIS R&amp team. And we're going to jump right into today's topic. We want to talk about some of the more interesting subjective projection dilemmas, including workload splits between different wide receivers and running backs around the NFL. So, Nate, you've got some good research on Todd Gurley and Darrell Henderson. What can you tell us about the Rams' backfield split this year?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious one is that it's really going to boil down to whether or not Gurley's healthy or how healthy Gurley is. I mean, we saw what happened to him down the stretch last year when he wasn't playing at 100%. The team seems to be keeping it pretty tight, whether or not he's actually going to, how good or bad his knee is. And then obviously drafting Henderson kind of shakes things up a bit even more. I really just kind of looked at, what Henderson did in college compared to what McVay likes to do. The obvious starting spot would be 11 personnel because that's what McVay's known for. Gurley took all but 6 of his carries last year out of 11. Henderson only took about 34% of his carries from 11. And then the other really noticeable one was that Henderson took almost all of his carries. It was 191 of 214 out of shotgun, whereas Gurley only took about 10 from shotgun. So some really kind of surprising discrepancies there between how they, the type of schemes they're coming from. The biggest similarity I found, though, was that both running backs really like to run off the tackle and to the outside. Both of them gained about 75% of their yards on those runs.
Henderson is a really interesting player because you have to ask just how much can he keep up what he did in college. I mean, the guy had 8.9 yards per carry, and you look at that and you think, well, there must be just a couple of really long runs that are biasing that. And then you look, and the previous season, he also had 8.9 yards per carry. So he was our number one running back in our backcast projections. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on what the health is for Gurley. And that's one of the things that's really hard about doing fantasy projections. We do our Kubiak fantasy projections every year, and you can do all you want to regress players to the mean and look at scheme and look at, how well the offensive line blocks to try to judge the running backs and all that. But there's a lot of projecting players that comes down to a coach's subjective decisions about what he wants to do and which players he thinks are better, and then injury situations that you just don't know the facts about. And that's a really tough one when it comes to projecting the Rams' backfield.
Yeah, I think this is a really tough one. It definitely is going to come down to the injury. But I think even if we can assume like kind of a mostly healthy Gurley all year, there's going to be a reduction in his workload that we can expect this year. So that part of it, we can figure in. There'll be some good mixing there. So I think in terms of Todd Gurley, Nate, you made a really interesting point in terms of the usage being really different. One thing that we could see this year, though, is that the Rams, yes, they've been a lot of 11 personnel the last 2 years. They've also been very pass heavy out of shotgun the last, at least last year. I can't remember the last 2 years. But we could expect to see some changes. We should see the Rams probably embrace more 21 or 12, like we saw kind of come back to bite them in the Super Bowl. I'd anticipate them being a little bit more multiple this year. But either way, Darrell Henderson, I think outside zone in terms of his production in college, and there was a lot of production like Aaron mentioned. I think that's the bread and butter of what the Rams want to do offensively is outside zone from one formation or another, and lots of different formations. And I think we'll see both these guys get a pretty fair amount of usage, even if they're both healthy.
I will say Gurley was the number one running back in fantasy last year. And because of all the question marks and because of the arrival of Henderson, we currently have him as running back 8, which, I mean, is quite a drop from what he was at last year. Usually, when running backs don't necessarily duplicate their performance the following year, but usually you're projecting them at least to somewhat duplicate their performance. But you just can't project that with Gurley.
Right. You think at least in terms of rankings, it would be somewhere near the same, but absolutely, I think you're spot on with that. And we knew, hey, coming out, he had knee injuries in college. We knew that this might be kind of a degenerative thing with him. So if this is kind of the beginning of the end, then they're right to be planning for it, and you're right to be projecting them accordingly. Let's flip side to the country, and let's go to Philadelphia. They drafted the Penn State running back Miles Sanders. They also brought in Jordan Howard. Aaron, What is your take on this situation? Who is the main back in for the Eagles this year, and how do you break this all out?
It is really hard to tell. A lot of people thought it would be Sanders. They took him in second round, but then he had a hamstring injury, and he's not participating in minicamp. So that sort of like leans things back towards Howard. First of all, I just want to recognize just how odd it is for a analytics forward franchise that has had success in the past with running backs drafted late in the draft or trade options like Jay Ajayi to use an early second round pick on a running back. It's almost as surprising as watching the Patriots use a late first round pick on a running back the year before with Sony Michel. That's another franchise that had lots of success with late round running backs, and yet here they are using an early pick. So let's
pause there, Aaron. Can I say, is there a difference between investing high draft capital in a running back versus investing a lot of money? Or are those kind of 6 of one, half of a dozen in your eyes? Because either way, you're dealing with finite resources.
I think that either way, you're dealing with finite resources. And I just think, a veteran running backs that you take in, that come from later rounds or come from free agency, Rex Burkhead types, whatever, are being paid roughly the same as a late round, first round pick. And an early second rounder like Sanders is I think, getting paid less than that. But you've given up the draft possibility of drafting a player at a position where draft position is much more important. You're drafting a pass rusher early in the second round.
Yeah, it's hard to say the Eagles aren't stacked right now. And I think if we look behind it, we have some research we've been doing on different positional aging curves in the NFL. And unsurprisingly, it looks like running backs seem to fall off a cliff much earlier than other positions tend to, which I think figures with what we know about running backs kind of historic, or what we think we know about running backs. So maybe they're thinking you get the guy in the draft, you get him on that first contract before you have to pay him, and then you don't really think about the second contract as much. But I think to your point, you've got to be stacked like the Eagles are in terms of front to back on their roster in order to be able to afford to try to make a pick like that.
So then the feeling is, well, if they spent a second round pick on him, which is it's a very valuable pick, they must really like him. Wouldn't they want him to be the starter and have him get the majority of carries? But again, now you have an unknown injury situation, and you don't know how much does participating in minicamp really matter for a rookie. So I think right now we have the projection for these guys almost evenly split 50-50. We have Sanders ahead by a few carries, but my guess is that early in the season it's going to be split 50-50, and then when you get into the later season, Sanders will be ahead.
Nate, what was your take here?
I think to Aaron's point, one thing I find interesting is, they spent all this draft capital, and last year they were reasonably successful, at least, spreading out those carries quite a bit. So it kind of makes it hard to see what their plan is going forward. One stat I found interesting for Sanders, though, in college last year, he was actually much better on runs to the inside. He averaged 6.6 yards per attempt. And he also, among the draft eligible running backs at least, had one of the bigger splits between his positive play percentage with zone blocking versus gap. That was 48% for zone, only 37% for gap. So I think that does make him a good fit for what the Eagles like to do. They almost more than half their carries last year were on inside zone runs. So I think that makes Sanders a good fit, at least schematically. And an interesting note on Howard is when a couple years ago he kind of had that breakout season. He did that by averaging 6 yards per attempt on outside zone runs. He also had kind of an outlier season in terms of breaking tackles. So I'm not sure if expecting a huge resurgence from Howard in Philadelphia this year is in the cards, at least schematically.
Sanders is also a better receiving back than Howard is. And, when you have a better receiving back who's also a runner, then you're not giving up what your play is going to be when you put him on the field. When you put Howard on the field, it's more likely that he's either going to be running or he's going to be blocking. He's not going out for a lot of passes, whereas you could do a lot more passing with Sanders on the field.
Yeah, and I know that Chicago, or I've seen some things coming out of Chicago, that's part of the reason that they parted ways with Howard is they wanted a back that was a bit more two-dimensional. So it's interesting you bring that up.
Yeah, his name's Tariq Cohen. I think Aaron, I think you hit it spot on. And then to get even more specific, in the early season, I think Jordan Howard is doing the first and second down and the goal line, short yardage stuff, whereas Miles Sanders is probably more the third down back if he's healthy. I think they'd like to get a point where Miles Sanders can be more of their lead dog with Jordan Howard just spelling him and being the goal line short yardage guy in an ideal world for them if he can come along like they progress. So probably Sanders with the higher upside there. Howard maybe a little bit of a safer kind of, you can expect a steady outcome from him. Will be interesting to see there. Let's keep it moving, and let's go to that Tariq Cohen situation. He's joined by David Montgomery and Mike Davis in the backfield in Chicago this year. Nate, what kind of information do you have about projecting out this Chicago situation?
So this is another tricky one. As I mentioned, there was a lot coming out of Chicago that they kind of wanted to replace Howard with a back who could be a bit more dynamic in the pass game on first and second down. But Montgomery didn't really have a ton of production in that sense in college. It's not to say he's a bad receiving back. It's just not something he did a lot of.
I think of him more like a Jordan Howard type of back.
Right. So I think it's interesting that there's like this consensus almost out there that Montgomery is going to take the first and second down duties when really he doesn't fit the mold that people seem to be thinking they were going to fill in with. Whereas Davis last year in more limited snaps had 34 catches for Seattle. So he almost seems to fit more of what they would be looking for in terms of upgrading from Howard. Not to say Montgomery's not a talented back, but just, from what's coming out, I could see Davis taking more snaps on first and second down than people expect. And personally, I don't see a huge change in Cohen's role. I mean, he was so successful in what he did last year. The only thing I could see is he was pretty successful from the slot. I think we had a stat come out last week that he was, of running backs, he was lined up out of position the most often. So maybe line him up out wider in the slot a bit more often, but I can't see a huge change for his role.
I will say that Montgomery had more receiving in his sophomore year than in his junior year.
Yeah.
He had 36 receptions in 2017, only 22 last year. So if you only look at 1 year, it looks like he's not much of a receiver. But if you look at a couple of years, he's more of a receiver. Like, he's not a receiving back, but he's not, Alfred Morris out there.
Of these guys, though, no doubt about it, Aaron, Tariq Cohen's the one that you want. And especially if
you're PPR.
PPR, forget about it. And to Nate's point, it'd be interesting to me. I think there are two possibilities. Either it's a similar role to what it was last year with what they did with him, or I think it's even more of that, and maybe even turning the dial a little bit on the entire offense. So in terms of, I think they might be a team this year that does a lot of 11 personnel with Tariq Cohen as the running back. And that can allow them to be a very dangerous empty team, which can put the defense in a bind, or they can run the ball with Tariq Cohen in the backfield, kind of looking at that 11 as base model and this kind of small back, real receiving package 11. That might be the modern NFL. That might be the best way to get points on the board, I think, especially for the Chicago Bears. So I look out for even more usage of Tariq Cohen if he can handle it. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and let's go to these wide receivers. But first, we will take a quick break to talk about SISBets.com.
Hi, I'm Corey March of Sports Info Solutions, and I'm here to tell you about SISBets.com. SISBets.com is an advanced prop betting information tool powered by Sports Info Solutions. Now you can leverage our proven projections model to find value against the odds. You're never more than a few clicks away from knowing which pitcher may surpass his strikeout prop, or whether your favorite running back projects to go over his rushing yards total. Just choose the type of bet, the player, and enter the money line to see the SIS Bets recommendation. That's SISBets.com.
Coming right back in, let's take it back to the West Coast and talk about the San Francisco wide receiver situation. A lot of changes to expect in San Francisco this year. Aaron, what do you make of the workload split there amongst those San Francisco wide receivers?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of word coming out that Marcus Goodwin is just not as preferred as he used to be. So I think everybody agrees that Dante Pettis is going to be the number one receiver now and going to kind of really explode off of where he was last year. But I figured if Goodwin, had a good rapport with Jimmy G, but there's been a lot of talk that he's not as big a part of their offense, and that Deebo Samuel, who I thought would be more of a slot receiver, is going to be more of the number two receiver there.
Interesting. I think he might be playing out of the slot, but be more of the number two option. I think he could be a volume guy. Pettis a volume guy. You still need the speed that Goodwin brings, at least on the field. Maybe not in terms of targets, but certainly him being the higher ADOT guy and him being somebody that can take the top off the defense. Nate, what did your research say about this one?
Yeah, so to Aaron's point, I also kind of see Samuel as more of a slot guy. His average depth of target last year was only 7.8, but he was one of the best in the country after the catch. He actually averaged more yards after the catch than he did in terms of air yards. His route tree is a bit limited. He only had 5 routes that he ran more than 5% of the time, but he's crazy athletic, and if you get the ball in his hands, he can make some plays. So that's kind of why I saw him projecting more as a slot guy. And that goes to the point, too, that outside of Kittle, they didn't really have anyone in San Francisco last year that kind of established themselves as that slot guy. So I kind of saw that as an opportunity for a rookie to step in there and make an impact. But, if they're not going to favor Goodwin, it could be interesting to see if they might slide him out a bit more and try and expand his route tree a bit.
All right, let's keep it moving and go to Green Bay. The Packers have an interesting situation. Lots of talk now about Aaron Rodgers and how he's getting along with Matt LaFleur. We know what to expect about Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, but what about those other receivers in Green Bay, Aaron?
Well, this is, I think, a really interesting situation. First of all, there's the question of sort of who's going to be the number 2 receiver between Geronimo Allison and Marquez Valdez-Scantling, to forever be known as MVS. So, Allison was really good last year in the 5 games where he was a starter, but then he got injured. So he only played 5 games. He had a 16.8% DVOA. He had 15.2 yards per reception. Valdez-Scantling, the big difference between them, they had the same yards per reception. Valdez-Scantling had twice as many catches because he played the whole season. He had a 52% catch rate compared to 67% for Allison. So, that reads a little bit to me like they're playing similar roles. To have that big a gap in catch rate reads a little bit to me like a sample size thing for Allison, where Allison I don't think was as good as he was in that 5 games last year. And as a rookie, he wasn't as good as, not a rookie, but the year before he wasn't as good as he was in that 5 games last year. So there's been a lot of talk that like Marquez Valdez-Scantling really fits, quote unquote, fits this offense. And I think that he's the number 2 guy there, not Allison.
Yeah, that jives with everything that I've been reading coming out of Green Bay. And I think, physically what he brings to the table is a little bit more exciting, to be frank. Nate, what did your research show up on this one? I'm sure you got something good from John Shirley.
I did actually talk to John Shirley this morning. And one thing he mentioned is he did some research a couple weeks back that actually showed that wide receivers on average tend to take the biggest leap going into their second season. So that could be another sign that MVS might step up. And another thing he mentioned as a Packers fan is that Aaron Rodgers didn't really seem to trust anyone behind Adams last year. Rodgers actually led the league by quite a bit in throwaways. So that could be part of he had the 25-2 touchdown interception ratio. But as he starts to trust those receivers more and hopefully, MVS can take that leap, we might even see Rodgers push the ball to those guys a bit more and see those guys have more of an opportunity at least to go make some plays for him.
We also have to talk about just the intense difference between the offense that Green Bay ran last year and the offense that LaFleur ran in Tennessee, and the question of whether LaFleur is going to run the same offense in Tennessee in Green Bay. For example, Green Bay faced the smallest average box on offense. Tennessee faced the largest average box on offense, partly because Green Bay was primarily playing 11 personnel, and Tennessee played a ton of 12 personnel, which meant they were bringing in the defense into a larger box. Green Bay ran shotgun 73% of the time. Tennessee only 58%. Green Bay was 27th in play action. Tennessee was 6th, so that's a positive. And run-pass ratios were much higher in Tennessee than Green Bay. And you look at who LaFleur has learned from, right? He learned from Shanahan, and then he spent a year with McVay. Well, the run-heavy and the using more 12 personnel sounds much more like Shanahan, not like McVay. I think people are expecting the Rams offense out of this, but you might be getting the 49ers offense out of this.
Well, two things that I think right away. Number one being, if we're looking at the differences in Matt LaFleur's offense to what Green Bay's offense was, it comes down to Aaron Rodgers and him being the strength of that offense, and the Titans having a completely different strengths and weaknesses in their offense. And I'd say hopefully he was playing to his strengths in Tennessee and doing what he thought was fit that team better. And to that point, the second point is I think we're going to find out really really a lot by about midway through the season this year about how good a coach Matt LaFleur is, specifically an offensive coach. Because if he tries to fit Aaron Rodgers into this, square peg that was what he ran in Tennessee last year, then I think, I've read some really good stuff that Warren Sharp has done on this topic. I think that would be a recipe for disaster, trying to keep going down that road. However, if he can mold this Packers offense around what makes sense for Aaron Rodgers, which I'm pretty high on his upside, his ability to do that based on what I've seen from him before last year, I think there could be some really interesting things that go on. So I'm optimistic about how this could go, but I think it's going to go in one direction or another. If he keeps trying to do that same old thing they were doing in Tennessee last year, I don't think that's going to be a great thing for Aaron Rodgers.
And to your point on that, Matt, is last year in Tennessee, Mariota's number one targeted player behind Davis. He used his running back Deion Lewis a lot. And then Mariota only pushed the ball downfield more than 15 yards, like 60 times for 27 completions. And it would be shocking to see usage like that out of Rodgers. So
the most important thing is that LaFleur not bottle things up the way he did in Tennessee and run so much. That's not what fits Green Bay's talent. What fits Green Bay's talent is to spread things out and let Rodgers throw it around.
All right, let's move to one last team, and we've got to congratulate them. I think we're all Ravens fans now. They made 3 analytics hires this week. So kudos to them there, and congratulations to those 3 new hires. We're excited to see that, and I think we know very little about what to expect from the sort of run-pass distribution, and then when they do pass, where that ball is going to go in Baltimore this year. Aaron, what can you tell us about what to expect from the first full year of Lamar Jackson?
Well, that's the thing, is that this is one of the really hard projections to do because you have no idea what to expect out of the first full year of Lamar Jackson, because what he did in that last 7 games of last year was such a ridiculously run-heavy scheme. It's one of the funny, ironic things about Baltimore getting so heavily into analytics now is that this may be the most run-focused team in the league, and now they're the most analytics-focused team in the league too.
But the quarterback running is something that I think analytics.
Oh, but the running back running was way up in those 7 games too.
Right.
Yes, quarterback runs tend to be positive expected value plays, but the running back runs were way up in those 7 games too. But then the other thing is then figuring out like who's going to get passes, right? Because they got rid of most of their receivers this offseason. Willie Snead is still there, and I would expect Willie Snead to play the same role he did a year ago and roughly the same number of passes. He caught 62 passes a year ago. We have him projected for 59 right now. Then they took the first receiver in the draft, which is Marquise Brown. So you're probably going to see a lot of Marquise Brown because there isn't a lot of other stuff there. But then there's like a whole hodgepodge of receivers and tight ends where you've got Chris Moore, who's a veteran, who's been more of a special teams guy. You've got the 2 guys that they drafted last year who never played as rookies, Jordan Lasley and Jaleel Scott. You have another rookie in Miles Boykin, who I think they took in the 4th round. And then tight ends, right? Mark Andrews, I think, is a really interesting fantasy bench candidate. He's the kind of tight end you want to take and throw on your bench because he could explode off of what he did last year, or he could be a guy that you never want to start. So it's not like you'd want to draft him as a starter, but he was the 2nd tight end they drafted last year. The first tight end they drafted last year, Hayden Hurst, was not as impressive as a rookie as Andrews was.
Right, that's correct. I really like both those players this year. I think the more Lamar Jackson's in there and the more those guys have had a chance to acclimate to the NFL. Remember, there's a lot to learn at tight end. You've got to learn the running game, all of the blocking, and then you got to learn the passing game, both the blocking and the receiving aspect of it. So there's a lot on your plate there. It's as much as you have to learn outside of the quarterback position on offense. So I think there's a learning curve, but I really like the potential of both those players. I like the way they fit in with Lamar Jackson, giving him nice big targets over the middle if the accuracy is a little spotty. And then I think the usage with Hollywood Brown is he's the guy that they try to take the top off with. They're going to try to get the ball to him down the field. He's a big play, explosive threat guy. But then aside from that, I think it's a lot of short stuff in between the hashes with those 2 tight ends and Willie Snead. Nate, What do you have?
Yeah, so really similar stuff to what you guys are saying is, my biggest question mark, I guess, would be if they can utilize Hollywood Brown in an effective way, and that would predominantly be down the field. His depth of target last year was 12.4, and he ran 46% of his routes down the field. And Jackson coming down the stretch with John Brown, they really never really get on the same page. John Brown, 30 targets, only 16 of those were catchable and only 8 catches after week 11. And only 6 of those targets were beyond 15 yards for no catches. Jackson overall on those throws on target only 52% of the time when he pushed it downfield last year. So that's my biggest question mark. And I mean, obviously that's something that can turn around. But, to get the most out of Brown, I think you've got to be able to push that ball downfield accurately.
Because he's not a big guy with great hands either. He's a speed demon. Right.
And one thing that could help there, and to Aaron's point, is Mark Andrews, I noticed, I think was their most efficient receiver down the stretch last year with Jackson in. He led the team second on the team in catches, led the team in yards with Jackson at quarterback, and he also tied with Snead for most first down conversions. So that seemed to be someone Jackson was getting comfortable with. So if Jackson can start, finding that safety net and getting those passes over the middle, that might make it a bit easier on him to start pushing the ball downfield to Hollywood Brown.
And hey, Nate, to that point, I think here's my hot take hyperbole of the day. I think the make or break thing for Lamar Jackson in his career is going to be his ability to throw the ball accurately deep. I think we know what he brings athletically. Obviously, his health is a big thing that's going to be a determining factor. But honestly, he's got to do things to protect himself, regardless as far as that goes. I think he's going to be able to do the things with the tight ends, with the slot stuff. It's going to be a matter of if he can be more accurate down the field, because that was a question about him. But if he can do that, all of a sudden there's a whole lot of grass that you have to cover as a defense, and it becomes a lot harder to defend somebody with the type of speed that Lamar Jackson has. So for me, in terms of his skill set, that's the thing that I look towards. So I love that you pulled that one out of there.
It's so hard to project what they're going to do with run-pass ratio because last year was so extreme. If you prorate those 7 Lamar Jackson games at the end of the regular season, if you prorate those to the whole season, they would have only thrown 373 passes all year. That's 50 fewer than any other team, with 203 quarterback runs, which is 90 more than any other team, and 441 running back runs, which would be second in the league.
That is a fascinating split. It'll be interesting to see how that one works out. All right, Nate, we've only got a little bit of time left, but we wanted to pick your brain a little bit. Is there anything interesting that you've been writing about lately, that you've been doing some research on coming down the pipeline, that you can update Aaron and I on, and we'll give our quick reactions to what the research is sounding like?
Sure. So right now, or most recently, I've been working on some like expected completions type of stuff and trying to find better ways to evaluate quarterback performance. So obviously Next Gen has their version out there where they can use their tracking data to look at the probability of a catch based on where defenders are relative to the receiver, where the pass rushers are, if the quarterback's on the run, things like that. And so what I did is I took kind of a different approach, and I've kind of looked at it in a more predictive fashion based on, the routes that are being run, the part of the field they're targeting, what the defense is doing schematically, how many rushers there are, whether the quarterback's under pressure. And it's actually able to get some pretty interesting results. And it's an interesting way to evaluate these quarterbacks, not only from how they're performing against their expectation, but also you can kind of see like Russell Wilson had one of the lowest expected completion percentages, like raw expected completions, but then above expectation, he was one of the best in like the plus minus stat. So that's kind of just another bit of evidence that, he was not being utilized efficiently last year, but he's still just a very good quarterback, and he completed 70% of his passes anyways. And so there's lots of really interesting things that you can take from metric like that along those lines.
So just to peel behind the curtain a little bit more, because I've been working with you on this a little bit, the what you're calling expected completions, that Next Gen has a statistic called expected completions that uses that coordinate data. And what you've done here, I think we're going to call it predictive completions, right?
Right.
And the idea there being that as opposed to looking at where the receiver is physically on the field at the time of his catch and where the defender is physically, understanding how the combination of the route that's being targeted and the defense that's being played is impacting the likelihood of the completion. So whereas NFL has their X comp, we're calling this P comp, in that it's more predictive, probabilistic completions, giving kind of that non-XY info. And it turns out it correlates very highly, right? You found it correlated like 0.8 with the Next Gen statistic.
Yeah, it was R squared of 0.82, I believe.
So even more.
Yeah. Really strong correlation.
Very strong correlation, but it's also looking at something that's a little bit different than what that NFL statistic is. So looking at the differences between them two is something that I found interesting. Aaron, what is your feedback from that?
it's always been the goal, right? From when we first started charting in 2005, the goal has always been to there's always been sort of this separation between two kinds of stats, right? The sort of mathy computational stats based on standard play-by-play, and the charting stats. And it's always been a goal to combine the two and do computational work on charting. And I think that's really where analytics has moved, especially in the last year or so, has been towards doing that kind of computational work on charting type stats. And I think this is just another really great example of that. And I look forward to seeing what the results are.
Yeah, we are excited about it as well. I can tell you Nate's been doing some awesome work. He is a prized asset of our Sports Info Solutions R&D team. And we're excited to see him to continue to grow in his career. So on that note, we will sign off and get out of here. Shout out to our producer, Justin Stein. And as always, please help us to spread the word about the Off the Charts Football Podcast by recommending us to your football-loving friends. It is always very helpful for you to subscribe, rate, and review. And as always, you can find us on Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS, me at Matt Mano, Aaron at FO_A Shots, and you can find Nate at Nate Weller with 2 R's. So that's at Nate WELLERR. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week for some more.